You have a chapter in your book titled A Unified Theory of Money." What is that pointing towards?
That's pointing toward the ledger system, which is
Okay.
basically, taking the commodity theory of money, which for the most part I adhere to, but then pointing out that there are these other credit aspects that have been there also since the beginning, since the
Mhm.
hunter-gatherer days. Um, and there were books like David Graeber's Debt, the first 5,000 years, where they basically say barter never existed in the sense that we think of it. He actually referenced there were essays by Alfred Mitchell Eames back in it was 1913 and 1914. He actually talked about those same subjects a while back. And my goal was to kind of take some of those arguments seriously enough to incorporate them into the model, which is
Mhm.
basically to say credit is a part of money that goes back to the earliest tribes. But it ultimately just comes down to what ledger you're using. And in small little trusted groups, you can use informal ledgers.
Yeah.
But anytime you want to travel between groups,
Yeah.
or anytime you want to act in a more self-sovereign or trust minimized way, that's where nature's ledgers come into play. That's
Right.
where
Right.
gold and silver and other commodity monies or proof of work via Bitcoin's energy system.
I see. So, is the challenge been something like, because early money, as you said, are these credit relationships, right? It's like it's somewhat obvious, like, oh, I'm going to go catch some fish. I'll share some with you. You give me some apples later, right? You could see how that would emerge in a very primitive society. But those are just promises ultimately, and that promises don't really work beyond the Dunbar number,
Yeah,
presumably, right? 150 people or
yeah,
whatever the
roughly.
number is. So then we need to then have some backstop to that promissory system. And then, so that's like leads you into gold and commodity money. But then to scale gold and make it function in a civilized society that's connected by telecommunications, we're back to promises,
Yes.
right? Because we end up sending these, oh, I'm going to debit your account, credit your account. But until that gold actually physically moves, you're trusting the custodian or you're trusting the counterparty or some
Yes.
counterparties.
Yeah.
So is that like, were we like with promises, then we went to commodity money, then we're like end up back at promises as we tried to scale commodity money?
Pretty much. It's because we ran into because our population got bigger and because we had telecommunication systems, we were
Yeah.
operating under a much larger network now.
Yes.
And so the scaling was needed, and then that also centralized power. Even when you look today, the fun thing about fiat currencies is it's basically globally it would look like a barter system. There's like 180 currencies.
Yeah.
They work within their country.
Right.
Sometimes I even bring around currency with me, like Egyptian pounds or Norwegian kroner, and point out that this is basically not even money here.
Yeah.
If I wanted to find someone to accept it for good service, it'd actually be kind of like uniquely hard,
Yes.
even though these are ubiquitous monies in their place of origin.
Right.
And that's why even on the global scale with fiat currencies, they all tie into the top biggest one or two currencies in the world, for the most part the dollar, to avoid that problem. And so it applies both to commodity money and then even to other fiat currencies.
Yes.
When you have these centralized systems and you have to go beyond that existing trusted relationship.
Yes. Okay. When I was debating Peter Schiff, this was like probably the crux of my argument that you can't scale gold without promises. Um, do you agree with that? Is that in trying to like crystallize the argument of why Bitcoin over gold? Is it that we can scale Bitcoin? I don't want to say without promises, but with a lot less reliance on promises. There's still going to be counterparties in capitalism and all that, so there's always going to be some counterparty risk. But we can do that in a counterparty risk minimized way, whereas we cannot scale gold in that way.
Yeah, I think that's the crux of it. And it's not to say that gold is now useless,
Yeah.
but much like how gold was kind of treated as the backstop for the equities and financial markets, I think in a digital world, gold's kind of the backstop. If people have, what about tail risks of everything going offline or something? People do like the physical aspect of having, say, gold in their
Of course.
house or whatever. So it's not to say that it's useless, but it doesn't serve that same purpose of really trust minimize money.
Yeah.
And even like Bitcoin gives us totally new things you can do with it. Like you can do multi-sig custody
Yeah.
and split your keys on multiple jurisdictions,
Yeah.
so that even technically a nation state has trouble getting to it in any sort of direct sense.
Yeah.
Whereas with gold, and this is really any real world assets, even if you put something like a blockchain on top of it, it's still tied to where's the actual custodian held, what is the legal chain that works there.
The Oracle problem, right?
Yeah, and like for example, and people often say, well, why can't you make like a gold-backed crypto? And it's like, well, they've existed for years. There are gold stable coins there's a market demand for them. It's not very big, but it exists. And I can imagine, for example, if you want to, have access to gold, but you're in an environment where it's hard to get physical gold, you can't get the gold ETF, you can at least get this, semi-trusted chain of custody to hold that gap for you. But it's only the same problem that they ran into time and time again.
This has been like a game theoretic conundrum forever then, right? Like, how do we exchange with one another in a way that we don't need to trust one? This is Nick Szabo's term, right? Trust minimization. Yeah. Why has it been, I mean, it seems like, I don't know, like there is no other solution than Bitcoin? Like, is there any, like, say, if we didn't have Bitcoin, would there have been another solution to this problem?
I think eventually something like Bitcoin would have been invented.
Okay.
I mean, it could have, there's certain arbitrary things it could have been. It could have had a 42 million supply cap, for example. It could have had 12-minute block times. Yeah. But I think something like it, and we saw that, I mean, bringing up Nick Szabo, there was this existing chain of people that were working on it. It goes back to David Chaum, at least. Yeah. Back in the 1980s, he literally, his like dissertation at Berkeley was like, basically, how can mutually distrusting groups operate a ledger? Yeah. That's basically what he was doing. Right. And then when you add things like, what Nick added to it, what Adam Back added to it, what Hal Finney added to it, they were all kind of putting these pieces together. And it got to the point where they had, like, Hal Finney had reusable proof of work tokens. Yeah. That's very close to Bitcoin. And they didn't quite crack the decentralization problem, which Satoshi ended up doing with the difficulty adjustment, which continues to be kind of an underrated aspect. They added a fairly straightforward control loop to make this system work. And basically what that does, it takes Fedwire. So Fedwire is this foundational ledger that banks tie into. And it basically says, well, we can have something like that, but we can have it open source and backed by proof of work and no single entity is in charge of it. And it's got fixed units instead of arbitrary units. Mm-hmm. And that's now a competition that exists. I think another way of putting it is it makes trust optional. Because even with something like Bitcoin, there are still scaling issues that sometimes custody solves. But for example, if you have $1,000 spending wallet versus, a $100,000 like life savings wallet, you have two different security requirements for those types of things. And sometimes you want the speed and convenience. It's kind of like how, you might have money in your physical wallet you bring around with you. You'd prefer not to lose it, but it's not the end of the world if you do. And I think that basically what this whole open source stack does is it says we can now choose who we trust and under what circumstances we trust. Whereas the fiat system, there's no option. Like for Bitcoin, if you were operating in any sort of economic sense, you need a bank account, and every bank that exists by permission of the central bank and the governing body. And so you have this big closed-sourced, fully centralized stack, and trust was mandate. You had to trust. And now, at least you have the option to say, who do I trust and under what circumstances? Right.
That makes a lot of sense. And you can't even opt out of that system. If you're fully paranoid in a fiat system and you're the guy that stashes all your cash under the mattress, you still have the counterparty risk of the central bank, right? Hyperinflating the currency, deauthorizing it, whatever they may do.
Well, and even things like, running a business, getting a paycheck as an employee. I mean, we see them when people are debanked. It makes hard to function in the modern society. And that's something that prior to Bitcoin, there kind of was no answer to. And now there's an answer to it. And, these systems aren't designed so that every single person is, say, fully sovereign for every transaction they ever do in their life. But they always have the option to kind of fall back into more self-sovereign aspects when they feel like they need to, or they always have that optionality.
Yeah, that's the big change, right? That you can not be fully exposed to counterparties. Right? Yeah. You can be the full-blown actual crypto anarchist running Bitcoin and have basically zero counterparty risk if you operate it properly.
Yeah, you have total workarounds that didn't exist before. Yeah. That's huge.
Yeah, and then just to reiterate the point on a multi-key custody solution, that is so fascinating, right? That we now don't even have to trust a custodian, including whether that's ourselves or someone else. You can now split that up amongst custodians or yourself, your trusted loved ones, your accountant, your attorney, whoever. Such a game changer.
That's completely new for this entire asset.
Yeah.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, click here to find more just like it, and here to find our most recent episode. Also, make sure to like this video to help shine light on the corruption of money. and be sure to subscribe to this channel to stay connected.